Hi, my name is Dr. Rayshawn Ray, aiming to speak truth to power, and this is my daily thought. What if there were no black people? I know that sounds crazy, but this has been a narrative that has been purported, not just in the United States but across the world for decades, right? Interestingly, in the United States, this is something that has came back up with the Colin Kaepernick protest and the NFL players and high school players and college players and veterans and everyone who is joining in this fact that when we stand for the doctrines that supposedly hold our country up in the United States, that justice for all part, right, or that stanza in the Star Spangled Banner are things that we really, really need to address in our country. And so it's led to people making statements. For example, a few decades ago, well, maybe over 3 or 4 decades ago, people would start this back to Africa. You know, why don't black people leave? Why don't they go back to Africa? I mean, anytime when people are pursuing their equal rights as citizens and humans, that's something that happens, right? So it got me to thinking about what will we be missing, right, without black people? I mean, that's something that people oftentimes talk about. And part of this narrative is some people think that we wouldn't be missing anything, but I think we'd actually be missing quite a bit. And I oftentimes I'm amazed at how little people actually know these things. So I'll just give you a few highlights of some things that blacks have invented or patented that really changed the way that we go about doing our business in the world. So Dr. Charles Drew, who I hope most people would know, he basically came up with the way that we bank blood, right, and the way that we store plasma. And obviously we know all of the advancements that's led to as it relates to blood diseases and other forms of diseases, and also the way that we go about treating surgeries. Patricia Bath, she made significant contributions in ocular health. She actually invented a laser probe that allowed for us to actually remove cataracts and replace damaged lenses within the eye. So she's prevented thousands of people from being blind. Medical inventor Otis Boykin has more than 20 patents, including the controller unit for the pacemaker. Could you imagine what it would be like if we did not have the pacemaker, right, to regulate people's hearts when they go out of rhythm? Garrett Morgan, of course, one of his main inventions, he's done several things, is the traffic light. I mean, could you imagine if we didn't have the traffic light, right? Or Lewis Latimer, who played a vital role in inventing the light bulb, actually invented the carbon filaments that's in light bulbs that allows them to sustain themselves for longer periods of time. So all of the light bulbs that we have that allow us to use them for 100 hours at a time came from Lewis Latimer, right? And again, all these people are black, by the way, just to make sure that we're clear there. Sarah Gould actually received a patent and invented the folding bed. So if you've ever been in a small apartment, say like in New York or San Francisco, and you have a folding bed or a desk that transforms into something else, this came from her, right? Garrett Morgan, as I mentioned, was also responsible for several other things, including the gas mask. So there was a period of time when firefighters would go into a fire without gas mask. I mean, can you imagine how many firefighters were dying, right? Garrett Morgan invented the gas mask that is now allowed firefighters to go into fires and try to save people and save property and do those sorts of things. So that came from him. You have physicist George Carruthers, who invented a UV telescope that was actually used in the Apollo 16 space mission. That allowed us to see more than 500 stars and galaxies, which had never been done before. I mean, there are several other things. So Dr. Shirley Jackson, who's an American physicist, she has an impressive list of inventions, including the theoretical developments responsible for telecommunications developments, including the touch-tone phone, the portable fax, the caller ID, call waiting, fiber optic cables. Could you imagine if we did not have her technology? I actually wouldn't be able to do this video right now, right? So all the things Steve Jobs did with the iPhone and advancing technologies with mobile phones, before that, she set the tone for those sorts of things. Let's see. There are also others. Oh, Mary Van Britten Brown, who was the first person to develop a patent for closed circuit television security. In other words, all of the security cameras that we have available to us, either in our home or in public places and stores and in restaurants, came from this woman, right? Let's see. Also, some other interesting ones. So Dr. Patricia Bath, who I mentioned. I don't really think that we understand how deep that is with dealing with eyes, right? In terms of dealing with cataracts and dealing with the sort of things that led to. Betty Harris led to a lot of advancements as it relates to explosives, particularly in inventing the technology to be able to recognize explosives when you can't see them, right? So think about the technology that we have in airports. Think about the technologies that we have in public places to try to detect metal, right, and explosives. Well, she was the one who came up with this. The list could just go on and on. About the things that's happened. George Alcorn, who is a physicist, he's credited with improving the imaging for X-rays, right? So think about this. Also J.B. Rhodes invented the water closet, now known to us as the toilet. There are so many things. The pen, related to digital computers. The list could go on and on about the sorts of things that African Americans have played a role in that have led to us being able to advance our technology. Another one, Mildred Kenner, along with her sister Mary Davidson. Kenner, who suffered from multiple sclerosis, she actually invented the walker and the toilet tissue holder, thinking about people who needed certain accommodations. Could you imagine if we didn't have these sorts of advancements? The things that we take for granted, right? That is fascinating because these are the things that many whites who make these statements, and this is actually coming from, I had a interesting conversation with a man on Twitter who was basically saying that black people have never done anything and actually haven't invented anything. And I just found this statement to be extremely puzzling. Even something like Sarah Boone, who improved the ironing board. If you're a big ironer, right, or if you've been in the military and you have to iron your clothes and you use that little corner sleeve, that thin part where you can put your pants in, or you can put the top part of your sleeve on that part of the ironing board, that was invented by a black woman. So there are several things that we take for granted that if black people were not around to do. And there are a few points that need to be made sociologically as it relates to this. First, most of these inventions were occurring right when the Civil War ended, right? So blacks gained some freedom, some form of citizenship. And look at the advancements that were made in a very short period of time. Of course, then Jim Crow happened. Black people were making these inventions during segregation, during a time when they didn't have resources. They didn't have funding. They couldn't get federal funding unless they were working with a white male scientist, right? That becomes very, very key in the lag. We saw men inventing things, then we saw women inventing things. So the interesting thing is that if you look historically and you listen to historians, there were other things that blacks were inventing, black slaves were inventing that they couldn't get credit for, right? And so there are a lot of advancements there. See, in addition to blacks dealing with segregation, with Jim Crow, with slavery, the inability to claim their inventions, the other part of this has to do with the narrative of black intellectual inferiority. See, throughout human history, particularly in the United States, scientists have worked diligently, particularly during the eugenics movement, during social Darwinism, to try to prove that blacks were intellectually inferior. This was one of the ways they tried to justify slavery, to justify segregation, to justify the marginalization, relegation, and discrimination against blacks. So they would go through extended links to try to do certain things to try to prove this. For example, they would take a white baby and a black baby, and they would sit them up, and the black baby would sit up and the white baby would fall, right? And they would say, oh, look, that proves that white babies' brains are heavier, right? So white babies' brains are heavier. Black people can control their bodies better. Now, this wouldn't be anything systematic, right? Some of the times the black baby will fall and the white baby will sit up. Both of them will sit up. Both of them will fall. They were actually falsifying these reports to try to justify black intellectual inferiority, to try to justify black relegation, right? The other things they would do, they would take a white cranium and a black cranium, right? And then they would say, oh, look, their craniums are different, right? Their skulls are different. But see, what they had done is they had falsified the black cranium. They would take a monkey and put it and merge it with the black cranium, right? And then they would say, oh, look, if we look at these three craniums, right, what we see is that the black cranium and skull is in between the Caucasian European skull and the monkey gorilla skull. I mean, you can't make this kind of stuff up. I mean, these are the sorts of things they would do, right? But what's interesting is that they never found anything that was valid or reliable to justify this. There was nothing scientific. Even with all of the advances that we have with technology, they have still not been able to find a gene for race. They have still not been able to find anything that proves that blacks are intellectually inferior or have some type of psychological or emotional deficit beneath the skin. And that's because race is only skin deep, right? Underneath our skin, we are all the same, right? And so these are the ways that our society has tried to justify black intellectual inferiority, and it has permeated all of our social institutions. So it's part of the reason why most of us don't know about these black inventors, right? I mean, there are several others I could have mentioned. These are just a few, right? And so hopefully this sparks a conversation about how we think about intellect, about what it means to not necessarily be genetically different. I mean, a black person and a white person can actually be genetically more similar than two black people or two white people. I mean, I know that blows people's minds, but it's true, right? And so we've been fed a lie. We have been bamboozled and hoodwinked into thinking that there are intellectual differences between people, right? Instead of realizing that that the main player here has to do with our social environment and the types of resources, particularly the structural environment we're in, and the discrimination on one hand compared to the resources on the other hand that people are provided to be successful. So once again, conversations matter like Black Lives and Books, and I hope that this has sparked one.